Welcome to True Crime Cases, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. Today's episode unravels a tale of housewife's secret love affair with neighbor's son leads to tragic murder. In the historic city of Savannah, Georgia, where Spanish moss drapes languidly from ancient oak trees and antebellum homes whisper tales of a bygone era, a sinister case unfolded that would shake the foundations of this genteel southern community. The year was 2019, and the city, known for its charm and hospitality, was about to become the backdrop for a scandal would captivate the nation and leave its residents questioning everything they thought they knew about their neighbors. At the heart of this tragic tale was Margaret Maggie Sinclair, 42-year-old housewife whose life seemed to epitomize Southern grace and propriety. Maggie, with her honey blonde hair and warm hazel eyes, was a fixture in Savannah's social scene. She was known for her impeccable taste, her involvement in various charity organizations, and her seemingly picture-perfect family life. Married to Thomas Sinclair, a prominent real estate developer for nearly 2 decades, Maggie was mother to 2 teenagers, 17-year-old Patricia and 15-year-old Randy. The Sinclairs lived in a beautifully restored Victorian home in Savannah's historic district, their life a tableau of Southern success and contentment. But beneath the veneer of perfection, Maggie Sinclair harbored a secret that would ultimately lead to her downfall. For the past year, she'd been engaged in a passionate affair with Father Michael O'Connor, the 38-year-old parish priest of St. John the Baptist Catholic Church. Father O'Connor, with his piercing blue eyes and charismatic presence, had come to Savannah 3 years prior, quickly becoming a beloved figure in the community. His impassioned sermons and tireless work with the city's underprivileged had earned him the admiration of his parishioners and the respect of the wider Savannah community. The affair between Maggie and Father O'Connor began innocuously enough. Maggie, raised in the Episcopal faith, had started attending Catholic services at St. John the Baptist out of curiosity and a growing sense of spiritual emptiness. Father O'Connor's sermons spoke to her in a way she had never experienced before, offering solace and meaning to a life that, despite its outward perfection, felt increasingly hollow. Private counseling sessions turned into long conversations about faith, life, and love. The emotional intimacy soon blossomed into a physical relationship, with clandestine meetings in the church rectory and stolen moments in secluded corners of Forsyth Park. For Maggie, the affair was a lifeline, an escape from the growing disconnection she felt from her husband Thomas. Thomas Sinclair, at 45, was a man consumed by his work and his ambitions. His days were spent in boardrooms and at construction sites, his evenings often occupied by business dinners and networking events. While he provided Maggie and their children with every material comfort, his emotional absence had created a void in Maggie's life. Father O'Connor seemed perfectly shaped to fill. The secret relationship between the housewife and the priest continued for months, hidden from the prying eyes of Savannah society. They were careful, meeting at odd hours and in out-of-the-way places. But as with all secrets in a close-knit community, whispers began to circulate. A church secretary noticed the frequency of Maggie's visits to Father O'Connor's office. A parishioner spotted them in what seemed to be an overly intimate conversation in a quiet corner of Colonial Park Cemetery. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, suspicion began to grow. As summer turned to fall in 2019, the pressure on Maggie and Father O'Connor intensified. The weight of their deception, constant fear of discovery, and the guilt that gnawed at both of them began to take its toll. Father O'Connor, torn between his vows to the church and his love for Maggie, became increasingly erratic in his behavior. His sermons, once a source of inspiration for his congregation, became rambling and unfocused. He was seen at odd hours walking aimlessly through Forsyth Park, his face a mask of inner turmoil. Maggie, too, began to show signs of strain. Her involvement in community events waned, and she withdrew from her circle of friends. Her children, Patricia and Randy, noticed their mother's distraction and mood swing, but attributed it to the normal stresses of family life. Thomas Sinclair, perpetually preoccupied with his latest real estate venture, remained oblivious to the changes in his wife. As October approached, bringing with it the promise of cooler weather and the city's famous Halloween celebrations. The situation reached a boiling point. An anonymous letter arrived at the office of Bishop Robert Harmon, the head of the Catholic Diocese of Savannah. A letter, written in a shaky hand, detailed the affair between Father O'Connor and Maggie Sinclair, providing dates, times, and locations of their meetings. The writer claimed to be a concerned parishioner who could no longer stand by and watch the desecration of the church. Bishop Harmon, a man in his 60s with a reputation for dealing swiftly and decisively with church scandals, immediately called Father O'Connor to his office. The meeting, which lasted for hours, could be heard through the thick oak door of the bishop's study. Raised voices and the sound of something heavy being knocked over filtered out to the anxious diocesan staff. That evening, Father O'Connor did not return to the rectory of St. John the Baptist. Instead, he checked into a small motel on the outskirts of Savannah, using cash and giving a false name. He made a single phone call from the motel room to Maggie Sinclair's cell phone. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. The next morning, October 15, 2019, dawned crisp and clear in Savannah. The city went about its business as usual, tourists strolling through the historic squares, locals hurrying to work. 7:45 a.m., Thomas Sinclair left for work, kissing his wife goodbye as he always did. Patricia and Randy caught their school bus at 8 a.m., leaving Maggie alone in the house. At 9:30 a.m., neighbors reported hearing what sounded like an argument coming from the Sinclair home. One neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Dupree, an elderly widow with a penchant for keeping track of the comings and goings on her street, saw a man she recognized as Father O'Connor enter the Sinclair house. She thought it odd, given the early hour and the fact that the Sinclairs were not regular attendees of St. John the Baptist. What transpired inside the Sinclair home over the next hour would become the subject of intense speculation and investigation. At 10:45 a.m., Mrs. Dupree, who had been puttering in her front garden, heard a scream followed by a loud thud. Alarmed, she called 911. The Savannah Police Department responded quickly. Officer Marcus Johnson and his partner, Officer Sarah Chen, arrived at the scene at 10:52 a.m. They found the front door of the Sinclair home ajar. Upon entering, they were confronted with a scene of horror would haunt them for years to come. Maggie Sinclair lay at the foot of the grand staircase, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. A pool of blood spread beneath her, staining the antique Persian rug a deep crimson. Her once beautiful face was barely recognizable, battered and swollen. A heavy brass candlestick, now bent and bloody, lay a few feet away. As Officer Johnson radioed for backup and emergency medical services, Officer Chen conducted a sweep of the house. In the master bedroom, she found Father Michael O'Connor. The priest was sitting on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. Black clerical shirt was spattered with blood, and his knuckles were raw and bleeding. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. The Sinclair home, once a symbol of Savannah's genteel society, became a crime scene. Yellow police tape cordoned off the property as curious neighbors and passers-by gathered to watch the procession of police cars, ambulances, and eventually, coroner's van. Detective Alexandra Alex Ramirez, a seasoned investigator with the Savannah PD's homicide unit, took charge of the scene. As she surveyed the carnage in the Sinclair foyer, she knew this case would be one for the books. The brutal murder of a prominent socialite by a Catholic priest was the kind of scandal that could tear our community apart. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of secrets, lies, and hidden passions that ran far deeper than anyone in Savannah could have imagined. Detective Ramirez and her team worked tirelessly, piecing together the events that led to that fateful morning. The autopsy revealed that Maggie Sinclair had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with repeated blows from the candlestick found at the scene. The medical examiner, Dr. Evelyn Wong, noted defensive wounds on Maggie's arms and hands, indicating she had fought desperately for her life. Father O'Connor, initially in a state of shock, eventually provided a statement to the police. He claimed that he had come to the Sinclair home that morning to end his relationship with Maggie, having been confronted by Bishop Harmon the day before. According to his statement, Maggie had become hysterical, threatening to expose their affair to the entire community if he left her. In the heat of the argument, he claimed she had attacked him with the candlestick. He had wrestled it from her, and in the struggle, she had fallen down the stairs. Panicked, he had struck her to silence her screams, not realizing his own strength in the moment of crisis. As news of the murder spread through Savannah, the community reacted with shock and disbelief. John the Baptist Church became the center of a media firestorm, with reporters from across the country descending on the city. Parishioners struggled to reconcile the image of the charismatic and compassionate Father O'Connor with the man now accused of murder. The Sinclair family was devastated. Thomas Sinclair, upon being notified of his wife's death at his office, collapsed and had to be hospitalized for shock. Patricia and Randy, pulled out of their high school classes by solemn-faced administrators, were thrust into a nightmare they could scarcely comprehend. As Detective Ramirez dug deeper into the case, she uncovered a history that painted a more complex picture of Maggie Sinclair and her relationship with Father O'Connor. Interviews with Maggie's closest friends revealed a woman who had been struggling with depression and a sense of purposelessness in her marriage. Her involvement with the church had initially been a way to find meaning, but it had evolved into something far more complicated. A search of Maggie's personal effects turned up a journal hidden in a false bottom of her jewelry box. The entries detailed her growing infatuation with Father O'Connor, the excitement of their clandestine meetings, and later, fear and guilt as the affair deepened. The final entry, dated the night before her death, was particularly chilling. In it, Maggie wrote of her determination to end the affair, recognizing the destruction it was wreaking on her life and the lives of those around her. Father O'Connor's background also came under scrutiny. Detective Ramirez discovered that this was not the first time the priest had been involved in a scandal. In his previous parish in Boston, there had been rumors of an inappropriate relationship with a young parishioner. The matter had been quietly handled by the church, with Father O'Connor being transferred to Savannah, give him a fresh start. As the investigation progressed, the case against Father O'Connor seemed increasingly solid. Forensic evidence from the crime scene, including DNA analysis and blood spatter patterns, contradicted key elements of his statement. The candlestick bore only his fingerprints, not Maggie's, casting doubt on his claim that she had initially wielded it against him. Prosecution, led by District Attorney Caroline Lawson, built a case arguing that Father O'Connor had come to the Sinclair home that morning with the intention of silencing Maggie permanently. They theorized that, facing the loss of his position and reputation if the affair came to light, he had decided that murder was the only way out. The trial of Father Michael O'Connor began in the spring of 2020, drawing national attention. The courtroom was packed each day with spectators, journalists, and members of both the Catholic and Savannah communities. Proceedings were a sensation, filled with revelations that shocked even those who thought they knew Maggie and Father O'Connor best. Former parishioners testified to Father O'Connor's charisma and the special attention he seemed to pay to some of the women in his congregation. Maggie's friends spoke of her increasing withdrawal from social circles and her obsession with her spiritual life. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of the church secretary, who described overhearing heated arguments between Maggie and Father O'Connor in the weeks leading up to the murder. Thomas Sinclair took the stand, a broken man. He spoke of his love for Maggie and his regret at having been so consumed by his work that he had failed to notice her unhappiness. His testimony painted a picture of a marriage that had been slowly crumbling for years, creating the perfect conditions for Maggie to seek solace elsewhere. The defense team, led by renowned attorney James Blackwell, fought hard to portray Father O'Connor as a man who had been seduced by Maggie Sinclair and then trapped in a situation that had spiraled out of control. They brought in character witnesses who spoke of Father O'Connor's dedication to his parishioners and his work with the poor. A psychologist testified that the priest had been under extreme emotional distress, suggesting that if he had killed Maggie, it was not premeditated but the result of a momentary loss of control. As the trial progressed, people of Savannah grappled with the implications of the case. The scandal had exposed the dark underbelly of their picturesque city, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about infidelity, the potential for violence in even the most respected members of society, and the ways in which appearances could be dangerously deceptive. The case also sparked a wider debate about the Catholic Church's handling of priests who violated their vows. Questions were raised about how Father O'Connor had been allowed to continue in his position, despite previous allegations of misconduct. The Diocese of Savannah faced intense scrutiny, with many calling for greater transparency and accountability. After weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Father Michael O'Connor was found guilty of second-degree murder. Courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps, sobs, and murmurs as the verdict was read. Father O'Connor, who had maintained a stoic demeanor throughout much of the trial, finally broke down, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The sentencing hearing, held a month later, was a somber affair. Victim impact statements were read, including a heartbreaking letter from Patricia and Randy Sinclair, expressing their grief at losing their mother and their anger at Father O'Connor for destroying their family. Thomas Sinclair, in his statement, spoke of forgiveness and the need for healing, surprising many with his compassion. Judge Henrietta Blackman, a stern woman known for her no-nonsense approach, sentenced Father O'Connor to 25 years to life in prison. In her remarks, she spoke of the breach of trust that made this crime particularly heinous, and the need for the sentence to serve as a deterrent to others who might abuse positions of power and respect in the community. As Father O'Connor was led away in handcuffs, the case that had captivated Savannah for nearly a year came to a close, but the repercussions would be felt for years to come. The Sinclair children, Patricia and Randy, left Savannah to live with their maternal grandparents in Charleston, the memories of their childhood home too painful to bear. Thomas Sinclair threw himself into philanthropic work, establishing a foundation in Maggie's name to support victims of domestic violence. St. John the Baptist Church struggled to recover from the scandal. Attendance dropped sharply, and it took years for the parish to rebuild trust within the community. The Catholic Diocese of Savannah, under pressure from parishioners and the public, instituted new policies for handling allegations of misconduct against priests. The city of Savannah itself was changed by the tragedy. Case had shattered the illusion of genteel perfection that the city had long cultivated. Residents became more vigilant, more aware of the potential for darkness lurking behind even the most respectable facades. In the years that followed, the case of Maggie Sinclair and Father Michael O'Connor became a cautionary tale, a tragedy that parents told their children and that new residents of Savannah quickly learned about. It served as a reminder of the destructive power of secrets, complexity of human relationships, and the thin line between passion and violence. Maggie Sinclair's grave in Bonaventure Cemetery became a site of pilgrimage for some, a place where people came to leave flowers and reflect on the unpredictability of life. On quiet evenings, as the Spanish moss swayed in the gentle breeze and the last rays of sunlight filtered through the ancient oaks, visitors to the cemetery might pause at her gravestone, contemplating the events that had brought her there. The tragic affair and its violent end had pulled back the curtain on the hidden dramas playing out behind the graceful facades of Savannah's historic homes. It served as a stark reminder that even in the most picturesque of settings, human nature, with all its flaws and passions, could lead to unthinkable consequence. As the years passed, the case of Maggie Sinclair and Father Michael O'Connor became the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and even a Hollywood film. Each new interpretation sought to unravel the complex web of emotions and events that had led to that fateful October morning. One of the most poignant outcomes of the tragedy was the impact on Maggie and Thomas's children, Patricia and Randy. The siblings, thrust into the spotlight at such a vulnerable age, struggled to come to terms with their mother's secret life and violent death. Patricia, who had been particularly close to her mother, suffered from depression and anxiety in the years following the murder. She eventually channeled her pain into activism, becoming an advocate for children affected by domestic violence and religious abuse. Randy, younger and perhaps more resilient, threw himself into his studies. He excelled academically, earning a scholarship to Vanderbilt University, where he studied psychology, driven by a desire to understand the human psyche and the factors that could drive someone to commit such a heinous act. Thomas Sinclair, once a pillar of Savannah's business community, found himself unable to continue his work in real estate development. The constant reminders of his life with Maggie were too painful to bear. He sold his company and moved to a small coastal town in North Carolina, seeking anonymity and peace. There he began writing a memoir, not of his business successes, but of his marriage to Maggie, and the soul-searching journey he embarked on after her death. The Sinclair home, once a showpiece of Savannah's historic district, stood empty for several years, a silent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Eventually, it was purchased by a non-profit organization and transformed into a counseling center for victims of domestic abuse and individuals struggling with religious trauma. A fitting tribute to Maggie's memory, Father Michael O'Connor's life in prison was one of isolation and reflection. He became a controversial figure among prison ministry, with some viewing him as a cautionary tale of human frailty, while others saw him as a manipulator who had betrayed his calling in the most egregious way possible. Reports from prison officials noted that O'Connor spent much of his time in the prison library, poring over theological texts and writing what appeared to be a lengthy manuscript. The Catholic Church, reeling from the scandal, implemented sweeping changes in the Diocese of Savannah and beyond. Background checks for priests became more rigorous, and a zero-tolerance policy for any hint of impropriety was strictly enforced. The case also reignited debates about clerical celibacy, with some arguing that the unnatural restrictions placed on priests created the conditions for such tragic events to occur. Detective Alexandra Ramirez, whose tireless work had been crucial in bringing the case to justice, found herself changed by the investigation. The complexities of the Sinclair case haunted her, leading her to question many of her assumptions about human nature and the nature of truth itself. She eventually left the police force to pursue a degree in criminal psychology, hoping to gain a deeper understanding of the minds of those who commit such crimes. The media frenzy that had descended upon Savannah during the trial eventually subsided, but the case left an indelible mark on the city's psyche. War guides added the Sinclair house to their roots, weaving the tragic tale into the rich tapestry of Savannah's history. Some locals complained that the constant retelling of the case was ghoulish and disrespectful to Maggie's memory, while others argued that it served as an important reminder of the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most respectable communities. In the years following the trial, several of Maggie's friends came forward with their own stories of secret pain and silent struggles within their seemingly perfect lives. Support groups formed, and a new culture of openness began to take root in Savannah society. Women who had once felt pressured to maintain an image of domestic bliss at all costs found themselves empowered to speak out about their own challenges and disappointments. The case also had a profound impact on the legal community in Savannah and beyond. Law schools used it as a case study in the complexities of prosecuting crimes of passion and the challenges of high-profile trials in close-knit communities. Prosecutor Caroline Lawson became a sought-after speaker on the topic of domestic violence and the importance of recognizing warning signs in seemingly stable relationships. As the 10th anniversary of Maggie's death approached, the city of Savannah grappled with how to commemorate the event. Some argued for a quiet remembrance, while others pushed for a more public acknowledgement of the changes that had come about as a result of the tragedy. In the end, a compromise was reached. Small garden was dedicated in Forsyth Park, with a simple plaque that read, "In memory of Margaret Sinclair and all those whose lives have been touched by hidden pain. May we learn to see, to listen, and to reach out to one another in times of need." The dedication ceremony for the garden was a solemn affair, attended by a mix of local officials, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens. Patricia and Randy Sinclair, now adults with families of their own, returned to Savannah for the first time in years to speak at the event. Their words of forgiveness and hope moved many to tears and sparked renewed conversations about the long-term impact of trauma on families and communities. In a surprising turn of events, the ceremony also marked the public debut of a book written by Thomas Sinclair, titled After Maggie, A Journey Through Grief, Guilt, and Redemption. The memoir offered a raw and honest account of his life, before and after his wife's murder. The book became an unexpected bestseller, praised for its unflinching examination of the ways in which people can be strangers, even to those closest to them. As night fell on the day of the dedication, a small group gathered in Bonaventure Cemetery at Maggie's grave. Among them were Detective Ramirez, now a professor of criminal psychology, Caroline Lawson, the prosecutor who had become an advocate for domestic violence awareness, and Mrs. Eleanor Dupree, the neighbor whose 911 call had set the investigation in motion a decade earlier. They stood in silence, each lost in their own memories and reflections. A gentle breeze rustled the Spanish moss overhead, and in the distance, the faint sound of a ship's horn could be heard on the Savannah River. It was a moment of quiet remembrance, a recognition of the complex legacy left behind by one woman's life and death. As they turned to leave, Detective Ramirez paused, placing a hand on Maggie's gravestone. In that moment, she was struck by the realization that while the case had been solved, the full truth of Maggie Sinclair's life, her hopes, her fears, her deepest motivations, would ever remain a mystery. It was a humbling reminder of the limits of human understanding and the enduring power of compassion in the face of tragedy. The group walked slowly back through the cemetery, their paths illuminated by the soft glow of the antique street lamps. As they reached the gates, they paused, looking back at the shadowy expanse of graves and monuments. In that moment, Savannah seemed to hold its breath, a city forever changed by a case of love, betrayal, and the sometimes terrible consequences of the secret sweet tea. As they parted ways, each heading back to their own lives, they carried with them the weight of Maggie's case, a reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the importance of fostering genuine connections in a world too often content with surface appearance. The case of Maggie Sinclair and Father Michael O'Connor had come to an end, but its echoes would continue to resonate through the streets of Savannah and the lives of all those it had touched for generations to come. In the years that followed, Savannah would continue to evolve, facing new challenges and celebrating new triumphs. But beneath the surface of its genteel charm and historical beauty, the memory of Maggie Sinclair would remain. Cautionary tale, catalyst for change, and a poignant reminder of the complex, often hidden dramas that play out in the human heart. As the city slept that night, the old oaks stood silent sentinel, their branches heavy with Spanish moss and untold secrets. In the gentle darkness, Savannah cradled its history, both the glorious and the tragic, and looked toward a future shaped by the lessons of its past. The case of Maggie Sinclair had become part of the city's rich tapestry, a thread both dark and illuminating, woven into the very fabric of Savannah's soul.